Welcome to our Stronghold Iron 8-step video installation series. Today we tackle step number 5, setting your posts and installing your post caps. Hey everyone, Jason from Iron Fence Shop. In step 4, we went over how to calculate your post hole width and depth along with digging your post holes. In step 5 of our Stronghold Iron video installation series, we're going to go over setting your posts and installing your post caps. For today's video, you may or may not need to watch all 3 parts, depending on what type of post you're using for your project. We'll break today's video down into 3 parts. In part 1, we will go over setting your post in ground with concrete if you're using standard ground posts. In part 2, we will go over anchoring your post to a wall or slab using our surface mount flange posts. And finally in part 3, we'll go over installing your post caps on the posts. Before we jump to part 1, I do want to show one little tip that may help when we go to install your fence panels and gates later on. This tip applies to both the ground and flange style posts and has to do with how you orient the post. On every post, there is a seam running up one side of the post. This is where the metal was welded together. It can be hard to see on the outside of the post, but if you look down the middle of the post, the seam line will be more evident and look like a dark line going down one inside face of the post. Once you see where the weld seam is, orient your post so that the seam is pointing at the street or the house and not where the fence or gate hardware will mount. This can make drilling the self-tapping screws into the post easier. That weld seam is slightly thicker than the rest of the post and it can sometimes burn out drill bits or self-tapping screws prematurely. If you miss this step and have to drill into the seam, that is okay, it's not an issue. You may just need to drill a pilot hole first or drill a little longer. Let's get started with part 1, setting posts in ground with concrete. We'll start here since this is probably how 95% of our fence jobs get installed. If you're only using surface mount flange posts for installation, you can jump ahead to part 2. With your posts set in the holes, it's time to grab the concrete and get to work on setting your posts. Whenever setting posts in concrete comes up, there are 2 divergent schools of thought: the dry bag method and the pre-mixing method. Opinions vary on which is best, but we'll share what we recommend and why. If you aren't familiar with the 2 methods of post-concrete installation, let me show and explain the pros and cons of both. With the dry bag method, you cut the concrete bags open, pour the mix in the hole dry without any water, while you hold your post in the center of the hole against your string line. You'll then pour water over the dry concrete mix when it's already in the hole. Some guys will measure out the water based on manufacturer recommendations, but most tend to just kind of eyeball it. In my eyes, there are 2 pros to the dry bag method: speed and water saturated ground. By not having to premix and pour the concrete in the hole, it's much faster and easier, usually by quite a bit. The other benefit is if you have standing water in your post holes due to heavy rains or soaked grounds, you can let the concrete both absorb the water and help mix it at the same time. However, there are 2 big cons of the dry bag method in my opinion. The first and biggest in my opinion is you have no idea how much of that water is permeating the mix. It could look great on top and be half dry powder on the bottom. Will rain and groundwater help set that remaining dry mix? There's no way to know. The second con is that you can't fine tune the mixture. If you put too much water in and it's too soupy to hold the post up, now you have to brace that post in some way until it dries out enough to set. Sometimes it can be so soupy that you have to scoop some concrete out of the hole and add more dry mix in. With the premix method, we're going to pour our dry concrete mix into a tub or wheelbarrow, add water, and mix it before we hold our post in the middle of the hole against the string line and pour the mixed concrete in. This is our preferred method at Iron Fence Shop, and the reasons will be spelled out in the pros and cons. There are 2 pros to the premix method. First and most importantly, you know the mix is done correctly. There are no dry spots, and you aren't left wondering if it's completely mixed and gonna give you full strength. The second pro is that by mixing it outside of the post hole, you have the ability to fine-tune the mix. Too dry? Add some more water. Too wet? Add some more dry mix. Regardless, we like the premix method because it gives you control over the mix and peace of mind that your post footing is gonna be solid. To me, there's only one con to the premix method. It requires more work and time. I won't deny it's a lot faster and easier to pour the dry bag contents in the hole and then use a hose or bucket to just wet it down. Now, before we get comments below about how one method is way better than the other, and I'm a fool for liking or disliking one of the 2, I will say that both methods of getting concrete in your post holes are perfectly acceptable. We have had tens of thousands of posts installed using both concrete methods without reported issues. So use my pros and cons to choose which method you like best for your installation. However, going forward in the video, I'm going to assume you're pre-mixing your concrete before you put it in the hole and give a few tips related to it. When mixing your concrete for your post holes, you'll want it on the dry side. This means fully mixed without powder showing, but not soupy and watery. We want a consistency that is strong enough to hold the post up when you walk away from it and move on to the next one. I find there are two things you can compare your concrete mix to in order to judge if it's ready to go on the ground: chunky peanut butter and cookie batter. If you think of chunky peanut butter, it's loose enough to mix around in the jar, but also stiff enough that it holds its shape in your spoon if you just stick it in there. Same type of description with cookie batter. We don't want a cake batter consistency that you can pour into a pan. We want more of a cookie batter consistency where if you took a handful of the concrete mix and patted it into a ball, it would roughly hold its shape. With your concrete mixed, it's now time to start setting posts. Start on a corner or end of a run. Set your post in the hole and fill it roughly halfway up with the concrete. Make sure the position of the post is such that it is touching your string line. Use a small board or piece of rebar to tamp the concrete down and remove any air pockets down in there. Use your bubble level to make sure your post is plumb on all sides, and keep in mind that it needs to still be contacting your string line. Once you feel good about the post positioning, pour or shovel more concrete into the hole. Leave a roughly 2-inch space from the concrete to the top of the hole. This will allow you to later cover the concrete footing with dirt and allow grass to grow around the post. Using your bubble level, ensure that the post is still plumb on all sides and it's contacting your string line. The post should be able to stand on its own in the concrete if it was mixed to the correct consistency. As you move through your layout concreting the posts in, be sure to measure between the posts to double check your spacing calculated back in step 2. You can use cut boards and use them as spacers to check as you go down the fence line, or you can just use one of your fence panels. I do recommend going back and checking your post with a level and verifying spacing about every 3 to 4 post holes depending how hot it is and how fast you're moving. If you find any posts have shifted or need adjustment for the space between posts, use a rubber mallet to tap them into place while the concrete's still wet. If you find your post spacing became slightly off when checking things, don't freak out. If they are fence posts and too close together, you can trim your rail in slightly to make them fit. If your post ends up too far apart, know that you can essentially cheat anywhere from a 1/2 inch to 3/4 inch wider with your iron fence brackets. Gate posts need a little closer attention, but unless you're using the self-closing hinges and latch for swimming pool code, your hinges and latches have some adjustability as well. Allow the concrete to dry to the point you can no longer move the post in the hole or poke the top to get it to indent or leave a print. Once it's reached that point, you can shovel dirt over the concrete in the last 2 to 4 inches to the top of the hole. It's often a good idea to mound the dirt above the yard line to allow for the soil to settle without leaving a depression. Ideally, this will be done the day you set the post so that if it rains or snows, water does not begin pooling on top and oversaturating the still curing concrete. Follow the concrete maker's recommendations on how long the concrete should be allowed to set up. We recommend waiting at least 24 hours in the summer to hang your panels and gates if possible. Keep in mind that very wet ground and colder temps can affect curing time, making it take longer. Now, if you're only installing ground posts for your project, then what I consider the toughest part of the installation is over. You can jump ahead to part 3 about installing your post caps. If you're mounting on top of a wall or a concrete slab, then you'll want to start here. Part 2 is anchoring on a slab or wall with surface mount flange posts. If you haven't done so already, you'll want to go around the layout and set the flange post down at the marked spots you made back in step 3. Don't forget to take into account the amount of space your chosen anchor wants from the edge of the surface to the bolt hole. You will almost never be mounting your post with the flange against the edge of the surface. That being said, this also assumes you've sourced your hardware anchor mentioned back in step 1. Each flange post requires 4 anchors in a 3/8 inch size to fit through the 1/2 inch holes in your flange. The length required will vary based on what type and thickness of surface you're mounting to. If you haven't sourced your flange post anchor bolt hardware yet, I'll put a link in the description below for a video that goes into more detail on the anchor bolt hardware typically used. With your posts all standing in place, I recommend marking, drilling, and bolting down 1 post at a time. That gives you a fixed point to double check your measurements to the next post in line. Once the holes are drilled, there's no easy way to slightly adjust them. Going 1 post at a time will ensure that 1 post out of kilter doesn't mess up all the posts in line after it. With your flange post laid out, you'll start by marking the surface for drilling. Sharpies, grease pens, chalk, paint, they're all acceptable ways to mark the holes on your surface. The key thing is to make sure you're marking the full diameter of the hole in the flange so you can trust your mark denotes the center of the hole for your drill bit to start on. I recommend drilling 1 hole and then setting your post over top of it to make sure your marks for the other 3 flange holes have not shifted. Some folks also prefer to loosely bolt the first anchor down and then just drill the 3 remaining holes of the post in place to make sure nothing shifts. Just be sure to remove the post and touch up the finish on the flange holes before putting your anchors in. Drilling with the post in place will often take the finish off the inside of each bolt hole in the flange post. If you didn't catch it back in step 1, make sure the drill you're going to be using has a hammer setting. Simply using a standard drill will typically just burn out bits and get you nowhere. If you do not have a drill with a hammer setting, there's something you should be able to rent pretty easily. Also, make sure you're using a 3/8" drill bit that is specifically made for masonry drilling. You do not want to use a standard drill bit used for wood and metal, as that will not work and just burn out. As you drill each hole, use a shop vac to pull the dust out. Regardless of what sequence you drill the holes in, be sure to only snug the hardware down and use your bubble level to check the posts are both level and plumb as you go. If your level indicates when your post is not sitting level and plumb, use some stainless steel washers to shim between the surface and flange to get it where you want it. Once you feel good about the post placement and setup, go ahead and tighten your anchor bolts down the rest of the way. Be careful when tightening your hardware down. If you go too tight, you could snap the head of a Tapcon screw or deform the flange. You don't need to go all Magilla Gorilla on these. You just want them tight enough that your post will not wiggle or move around. With your post bolted down, measure out to your next post to make sure nothing is shifted, and repeat that process until all of your posts are set. You can cut boards and use them as spacers to check as you go down the fence line, or you can just use one of your fence panels. If you find your post spacing became slightly off when bolting things down, don't freak out. If they are fence posts and too close together, you can trim your rail ends slightly to make them fit. If your posts end up too far apart, know that you can essentially cheat anywhere from 1/2 inch to 3/4 inch wider with your iron fence brackets. Gate posts need a little closer attention, but unless you're using the self-closing hinges and latch for swimming pool code, your hinges and latches typically have some adjustability as well. Okay, at this point, my ground post people have concreted their posts in, and my flange post folks bolted their posts down. Our final part 3 is installing your post caps. While you don't have to fully install your post caps at this point, I do recommend you at least set the caps loosely on top of your post to keep rain and critters out. If you're stair-step installing your fence or you think you may need to trim your post tops level, then hold off completing this step. Just loosely put the caps on until the panels are mounted in the next step, and then circle back to this video. Let's assume you're ready to go and review how to completely attach your post caps permanently. This way they can't get stolen or accidentally knocked off. To install the post caps, we're going to use the supplied adhesive tube in your order and a caulk gun. Depending on the size and type of cast iron post cap, you may still see a hole in the cap and assume that is for a screw. While that was the original intention 30+ years ago when the caps were made, we no longer recommend using screws to fix the caps and do not supply them. Why do we prefer the adhesive method? For 2 reasons. First is that the screw heads are fairly noticeable, and when installed, kind of ruins a cleaner look around all 4 sides of the cap. The second and more main reason is that the screws would often cinch or pull the cap to one side and make it sit uneven when tightened down. The adhesive prevents that and can also help even out the post cap even if it sits slightly crooked. You're going to cut the plastic tip at an angle and then use this rod on the caulk gun to pierce the cover at the base of the nozzle. With the caulk gun, apply a bead of the adhesive on the underside lip of the cap on all 4 sides. You want the adhesive oriented so that when you press the cap on the post, the adhesive will smear and make contact with the inside lip of the cap and face of the post. If you find yourself running out of adhesive before completing all of your posts, this is not some special formulation that you have to get from us. Any hardware store has something comparable that you can use from brands like Loctite and Liquid Nails. Just make sure the one you choose is rated for metal and outdoor use. Curing time for the adhesive will vary depending on the temperature when it was applied. It could dry in a couple hours or may take a couple days if it's colder out. Be sure to wipe any excess adhesive off your post cap before it dries. If it dries before you can get to it, the adhesive can usually be scraped off with a credit card or soft plastic scraper. Just be careful not to use a metal scraper or razor, as it could gouge the finish when doing so. Congrats everyone! In my opinion, you are now past the toughest part of the installation process. In part 6, the project will really begin taking shape as we start installing the fence panels. You can click this link to access the 8-step install series playlist. You can also visit us here at ironfenceshop.com. If you have any other questions, you can shoot us an email at sales@ironfenceshop.com or give us a call at 800-261-2729. We look forward to hearing from you.